Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you again and to study God's Word. We're going to continue with our theme that we've been following for the last few weeks, which is keeping His commands. And we know that God has given us a lot of commands. He's given us directions as to what He wants us to do in our everyday life and our worship, and has taught us how to be His children and to do His will. And we want to be sure that we are doing just that, keeping His commands. I think about the story that we've mentioned several times now as an initiation for this study. In Matthew 19, a man comes to Jesus, and he is a rich young ruler. And he asked Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And of course, when you think about that, we would say today, "What must I do to go to heaven when I die?" And Jesus told him what he needed to do. He said, "You need to keep the commandments." And he asked, "Well, what commandments?" And Jesus told him, began to quote some of the 10 commandments. And he said, "Well, I've done that. I've kept those commandments all my life. Since I was just a child, I've kept those commandments." So then Jesus says, "Well, then there's one more thing you need to do. Now you need to go and sell all you have and come and follow me." And he thought about all of his wealth, thought about what he had, what he possessed, and decided that was too much to pay, too much to give. And so he went away sad. And I think that a lot of people go away from, after hearing what God demands of them in their life, sad because they're unwilling to live the life that Jesus has taught us to live. When we go back and look at the very first human beings on this planet, Adam and Eve, we see that they sinned. They didn't have a lot of commandments. They just had that one situation where they had a tree in the middle of the Garden of Eden where they were living a wonderful life, carefree, and God said, "You can't eat the fruit of that tree, and you can't touch the fruit of that tree, or you will die." And they heard it, and maybe they believed it, but when Satan came and tempted Eve, she disbelieved God and believed Satan and decided that she needed to try that fruit, and she touched it, which was a sin in itself, and then ate of it, which was another sin. And then she gave it to Adam, and he did the same, and they became disobedient and had failed to keep God's commands, failed to do what God had ordered them to do. And they were rejected by God, cast out of the garden, because they didn't obey Him and because they didn't keep His commands. And then they had children, and we know about Cain and Abel, and we know that they apparently had been taught by God how to worship or what to do and worship to Him, to please Him. And they built altars, and they brought the fruit of their labors. We know that Cain brought cereals and brought the plants that he had grown, the things that were in his garden. And then on the other hand, you have Abel, who was a shepherd, and he brought a lamb and brought a blood sacrifice. And God was more pleased with Abel's sacrifice than Cain's, and that's how Cain ended up being jealous of Abel and killing him. And you have the first homicide in the history of mankind on the planet Earth, and there were only 4 people, and 1 died because of that. But it was also in relationship to worship. It was because Cain was rejected in his worship by God, and Abel was accepted. But it says that Abel offered his sacrifice by faith, and faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of God, which means that what he did was what God told him to do. And what Cain did was not something that God had asked him to do. Consequently, he was rejected, and Abel was blessed. But then that led to that death and the unfortunate situation. But today, we still have people who have problems in understanding that God tells us what we do in worship and not us. He determines how we live. He determines what we do in service to Him. And it's not for us to determine or decide. I would like to take an Old Testament illustration to sort of establish that truth. As you look back in the Old Testament, you find as the Jews came out of the land of Egypt, they needed a way and a place and a manner in which to worship God. And so God enabled them to build and encouraged them and commanded them to build a tabernacle. It was a tent. They were moving around from place to place for 40 years in the wilderness, and so they needed a place where they could have the presence of God seen and known, and where they could worship Him. And so a priesthood was established from Aaron. It goes on down, and you find that it continued till the time of Jesus Christ. And so they had a building, you might say, but it was a portable structure. The tabernacle was put out in the wilderness, where they had two different rooms in which the priest would serve. And out in the open area that was sort of fenced in, they had an altar where they burnt sacrifices to God. All of that was according to God's plan. And if you want to really, really get into it, you go back and read Exodus through Leviticus in the Old Testament, and then repeat it in Deuteronomy, and you'll see that there's a lot of detail about how they were to do that and what it was to include. I mean, even the color of the thread used in the curtains was determined by God. And every little piece of furniture was designed by Him. But there were two rooms in the tabernacle. One was the holy place, the other was the most holy place. And in the most holy place, they had one piece of furniture that God had demanded, and that was the Ark of the Covenant. I'm sure you've probably heard of that. And it was just a big wooden box. And it was covered with gold, and on top of it had a slab of gold on it, which was the mercy seat. And then above the mercy seat, there were two angels who were cherubim that were all gold as well. It had to be a very heavy structure, and it had to be a very precious, valuable structure as well, being made out of so much gold. But then, because they were meeting in a tent, or not meeting in a tent, but worshiping God through the priesthood that would utilize the tent, they had to have a way to move it, because they moved a lot in the desert. They were wandering around for 40 years in the desert. So how are they going to move this heavy box? Well, you can get a lot of men around it and pick it up and move it, but that's not what God wanted. He didn't want anybody to touch it. He said, this is where my presence will be. This is where I will speak to you. I will speak to you from this very site. And so you can't have men picking it up. You have to carry it with poles. And he had them put sort of round circular gold rings on the corners of the Ark of the Covenant. And then they would run the pole through that and pick it up and carry it. And they also put gold on those poles that they were using. Just a layer, it was just covered with a film of gold on it. And the men would use those, sticking them in the loops, picking them up, carrying them around. But they wouldn't touch the Ark of the Covenant, because that would mean they would die. If they touched it, they would die. And that was done for years and years and years and years. And finally, when they went into the promised land, they took the ark with them, obviously, and they worshiped God through that same means as before. But eventually, they wanted to have a permanent place. They had a tent in which that structure was kept, and where they worshiped God and continued on with the priesthood. It wasn't like out in the desert. It wasn't near as nice. And David decided later he would build a better tent, and then ultimately his son would build the tabernacle. Was cloth, but a permanent structure, a heavy structure, the temple of God in Jerusalem, and put it in there. But it also had a holy place and a most holy place, and the same priesthood and the same restrictions about touching the ark. But when David had the opportunity to fight against the Philistines on one occasion, he took that Ark of the Covenant out to the battle, thinking that might help him, because that's what the pagans did with their gods. They'd haul them out to the battlefield and put up there like a good luck charm and see what would happen. Well, David took the ark. In the battle, he lost that ark. It was taken away from him, and the Philistines had it. But then they realized that they were having a real serious problem with tumors appearing on everybody's bodies. I think it probably was something like cancer. But as a result, everybody was getting sick. People were dying. And they knew that it was because they had the Ark of the Covenant in their midst. And so they had put it in the temple of Dagon, their god, and Dagon fell down in the night. Nobody pushed it over. It just God, the Father, pushed it over, and it fell down right in front of the ark. And then they arranged it into their temple and had it standing once again. And the next night it fell again and lost its head and arms. And the people, their God's being attacked, they're being attacked, they're getting sick, they're dying. So it's time to get that thing out of there. So they decided to move the Ark of the Covenant and put it somewhere else in a better place. They were going to take it into the city of Jerusalem. And David decided to move it by putting it on a cart and letting it be pulled by 2 cows. Nothing about that in the Old Testament, but they did it that way. And as a result, one of the young men that was on the cart there, when it rocked, he was walking beside it, I'm sure, when it rocked, it looked like the Ark of the Covenant was going to fall off and could break to pieces. He reached out and touched it and balanced it. Well, that was prohibited. God had said you can't touch it. It has to be moved by the Levites, the priests, and they have to run those poles through the loops, and then they can carry it. But on this occasion, Uzzah, a young man, reached out and touched it, and he died. David was very upset with God for killing Uzzah for that offense, but it was irreverent, and it was disrespectful, and it didn't recognize the sacredness of God and this particular piece of furniture. So, as a result, we find that he died. And David makes the comment after it happens, well, I guess we just didn't consult with God. We didn't get his advice, and we didn't do what he prescribed. And that is so important, not doing what God prescribes. You find this in 1 Chronicles chapter 16. And he says we should have done what God said, basically. Oh, yeah, that's right. So David can't blame God for the death of Uzzah. Uzzah died because David decided to use a cart rather than let the Levites, the priests, carry the ark all the way into the city of Jerusalem. And then later they did. They took it on into Jerusalem. But how did they do it? Like God prescribed. They had the priest carry it. Now, today, we do so many things that we in worship to God that maybe other people wouldn't appreciate. We use a cappella music rather than instrumental music because in the New Testament, we're told that the church sang. We're commanded to sing. And we do that. And we don't have an orchestra. We don't have a big band. We don't use those things because it's not prescribed by God. And in the New Testament, we're told that women are to be silent in the church and not to be the preachers and the elders and the ones that carry on the service. And we do that as well. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, 34 and 35 says the women should be silent in the churches. And I talked to a preacher from one of the evangelical churches once and asked her, what do you think when you read what Paul wrote to Timothy and what Paul wrote to the Corinthians about women being silent in the church? She said, all those verses really do bother me because I know they're not what God prescribed. And I said, well, maybe you ought to do what God prescribed. Maybe you ought to do what he tells you to do and not what you think is best. I mean, Uzzah felt like it was the best thing he could do. His motives were good. I need to reach out and catch this thing before it falls. But that's unfortunate because it cost him his life. And we know that this lady was worried about the verses that said that she shouldn't be preaching. But when I asked her, I said, well, why do you do that? And she said, because I love God. And he gave me the talent to speak. And I want to do that. And so that's why I do what I do. And it was wrong. And it is wrong. And it shouldn't be done because God didn't prescribe it. And we talk about keeping his commands. Well, what do we do when we find his commands? We keep them. We do what he tells us to do. I Don't use priestly garments when I preach. I don't have any special garments. The priests did in the Old Testament. They were commanded to do that, and they had to have them. But in the New Testament, you don't see the apostles doing that. You don't see the people who spoke in the church in the first century or after ever doing that until many centuries have passed. And so we don't do that. Why? Because it's just not commanded. And then we don't use incense in our church. Why? Because it's not commanded. It's not something that God demands of us. And so we don't do it. If we had something in the New Testament, the New Covenant, the New Pact that God has given us, then we would be doing those things. We would have to do those things. We wouldn't have any choice. But since we don't have any authority to do it, we don't. And in the case of Uzzah, it's unfortunate he lost his life, but it was because he didn't obey the commands of God. Didn't respect that particular prohibition to touch it, to touch that Ark of the Covenant. So I ask you, what are you doing in your life that is evidence that you're keeping the commands of God? And I ask you also, are you doing things that maybe God has not demanded of you, that's not prescribed for you, that you're not only not obligated to do, but if you were to do them, it would be your own choice rather than God's, and it would be an act of disobedience rather than obedience, because you wouldn't be worshiping God the way He wanted you to. These things are really difficult to deal with, and people can be very sensitive and hurt by even hearing things like this. But I'm sure that that's what happened also to Cain when Abel's sacrifice was accepted and his was rejected. And we need to be sure that what we're doing is acceptable to God and that He is pleased with what we're doing and that we are obeying His commands. So let's continue with this theme of keeping His commandments. And Jesus says, if you keep my commandments, you love me. And we can show our love to God by keeping His commandments. And we can show that we don't love Him enough if we break His laws, if we don't keep His commandments. May God bless you. Thanks for being with us again today. Look forward to seeing you next week.